Testing.
Test, 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 test.
stress medication.
We wanted to give you time to make sure you could rip me apart, Mr. Pallone, yes. When do I do that? Now. Yeah, give it 10 minutes. Yes. Yeah, gotta do it every time, you gotta be flexible. So, we're good? What do you think? The subcommittee will come to order. The chair recognizes himself for an opening statement. Kind of before we do that, we're going to do the opening statements, and then the schedule is that votes should be called around 1:20. Then we'll go votes, and then we'll come back, and we'll probably at that time deal with the amendments. Secondly, I want to embarrass my son, who's in the front row on the right with the short sleeve white shirt. So that's a to-do list, and I got that done.
Hi, son. Hi, son. Are we going to share his name?
Oh, what is his name? I don't know.
I'd like to introduce my son in the pink tie on the front there, too.
Daniel Shimkus is my son's name.
right,
So,
Daniel.
yeah, so. Good afternoon, and welcome to today's subcommittee markup of H.R. 3128, a bill introduced by Mr. Griffith last year, which clarifies when changes at stationary sources should be subject to new source review pre-construction permitting. The legislative text we consider today is substantially similar to the discussion draft we examined in our May legislative hearing, reflecting the technical feedback from EPA and stakeholders. It will be offered as an amendment in nature of substitute to H.R. 3128, upon which the text is based. New Source Review Program is desperately in need of reform. Witnesses have testified that the New Source Review Program is overly complex and is discouraging companies from doing things that we all want them to do, like improving energy efficiency, making incremental pollution control upgrades, and keeping facilities in good working order. Perhaps the most frustrating aspect of the New Source Review Program is that the regulated community and even the regulators themselves are confused about what types of facility upgrades require a company to obtain a New Source Review permit. In theory, only projects that result in an emissions increase require a New Source Review permit. However, in practice, we've seen examples where the EPA has issued enforcement actions against companies for making facility upgrades that actually resulted in an emissions decrease, which doesn't make any sense. An environmental program that discourages companies from carrying out environmentally beneficial projects is an environmental program that needs to be reformed. And that is exactly what Mr. Griffith's legislation does. Today's bill makes the New Source Review Program work better by clarifying that the only types of facility changes that require a New Source Review permit are changes that increase a facility's capacity to emit pollutants at the higher hourly rate. Opponents of New Source Review will claim that this legislation will result in massive pollution increases. This is simply not true. The legislation applies solely to stationary sources and actually removes hurdles to installing pollution control projects and devices. Most important, it does not affect operating permits and other regulatory tools used to set emission limits at major facilities. 2 state air regulators testified before this subcommittee that the Clean Air Act currently provides a range of effective tools and programs to successfully control emissions from existing sources, and that nothing in this legislation will change that. This bill's clarification in the law will make it easier for companies to invest in, modernize, and existing facilities, leading to a stronger economy and more jobs. For these reasons, a wide range of stakeholders have sent letters in support for New Source Review reform, including multiple labor unions representing the building trades, National Association of Manufacturers, National Rural Electric Cooperative Association, American Public Power Association, American Forest and Paper Association, Portland Cement Association, American Iron Steel Institute, National Mining Association, U.S. Chamber, Pennsylvania Chamber of Business and Industry, American Energy Alliance, and Citizens for Responsible Energy Solutions. I look forward to voting in favor of this legislation. I urge my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to do the same. I now recognize my friend from New York, Mr. Tonko, for 3 minutes for an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And today we are here to consider H.R. 3128, which would make a number of significant changes to EPA's New Source Review Program for existing sources of emissions. Over the last half-century, we have gained a better understanding of how dangerous air pollution can be and have developed impressive technologies to reduce it. During our oversight and legislative hearings on New Source Review, we heard how important the program is to reducing harmful air pollution. But this bill would ultimately enable some polluters, many of which were initially grandfathered into the NSR program and have avoided installing pollution controls for decades, to continue operating without taking any steps to clean up their facilities. Today, many old coal-fired power plants are entering the end of useful life unless they undertake significant capital investments. Under the current NSR program, if these facilities make a major modification, the grandfathering is over and modern pollution controls would be required to be installed. The discussion draft before us today would create new loopholes to enable those old facilities, which have put off adopting pollution reduction technologies for decades, to continue polluting our air indefinitely. And I do not think that is fair. It is not fair to the facilities that have made the investments to clean up their pollution, and it is not fair to the people that live and work near these sites. I understand that businesses need time to transition and plan for the investments needed to install pollution controls. But now we have 4 decades of evidence of facilities going to great lengths to avoid triggering the major modification requirement. And turning to Congress is just the latest attempt. Allowing major polluters to extend their lives while avoiding installation of available technology to prevent unnecessary pollution is unacceptable and runs counter to the bipartisan intent of the Clean Air Act. I want facilities to be able to invest in efficiency and reliability upgrades. And I want United States businesses to be as competitive as possible, but it cannot come at the expense of their neighbors' health. This bill will result in dirtier air, and I urge members to oppose it. And with that, Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back his time, and I thank him. The chair looks for the chairman of the full committee. He has not arrived yet, and chair would like to now recognize, if he is ready, the ranking member of the full committee, Mr. Pallone, for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The bill before us today is a bad bill that puts polluters before people. If Republicans on this committee were serious about protecting the environment and human health, they would have never brought this bill up for a markup. And that's, of course, not the case. We're here, and as I said at the legislative hearing in May, the threshold test for any legislation to reform the Clean Air Act is whether it will reduce air pollution and protect public health. The amendment in the nature of a substitute is far more likely to increase air pollution substantially and put the health of the American public at great risk in the process. This bill exacerbates existing loopholes in the new source review program to the benefit of old polluting facilities that have avoided complying with modern pollution control standards. These bad actors have been able to game the system to change operations and expand without ever reducing emissions, and this bill only makes this problem worse. It ensures that anyone downwind of these plants will be forced to continue breathing polluted, unhealthy air every day. Neighboring communities will get no relief from the many health problems associated with chronic exposure to pollution, asthma attacks, heart and lung disease, and of course cancer. This bill amounts to a pro-polluter wish list that is so egregious it would be virtually impossible to compel dirty facilities to clean up their act. The legislation essentially grants a permanent amnesty to bad actors, giving some of the oldest and least economical facilities in the country the green light to pollute without consequence. And if states try to avoid overall increases in pollution using other Clean Air Act authorities, as some have suggested, these reductions will have to come from businesses in other economic sectors. So this creates a very unfair situation where some businesses have no obligation to clean up pollution and others are left footing the bill. The Trump administration has spent its time undermining public health protections and diverting the mission of the Environmental Protection Agency away from protecting public health to protecting polluters. This bill continues that pattern of prioritizing the needs of polluters over people. It codifies the administration's plans to forego enforcement of the Clean Air Act and lets polluters off the hook. I urge my colleagues to oppose it because the American public deserves better from Congress. It's just another handout to the special interests and not worthy of debate in this subcommittee. In fact, this time could have been better used getting answers from HHS on the progress or lack thereof that is being made to reunify more than 2,500 children who were forcibly stripped away from their parents by the Trump administration's inhumane immigration policies. And I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back his time. Chair now recognizes the chairman of the full committee, Mr. Walden, for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks for your leadership on this and so many other issues. Today, we take an important step in this committee's work to advance reasonable updates to our environmental laws to ensure more effective environmental programs as well as more productive economy. Now, H.R. 3128 was developed by Congressman Griffith, and it addresses a problem that has been identified in the Clean Air Act's new source review program, and that is the controversy surrounding when a change in a major source of emissions, be it an efficiency improvement, an emission control improvement, or basic upkeep and parts replacement, is sufficient to trigger a pre-construction permitting. The uncertainty over this costly, time-consuming process creates powerful incentives to avoid making beneficial improvements to manufacturing and other facilities. Now, this deprives communities benefits for the environment and for efficient operations that help increase jobs and economic activity. So this bill simply adds much-needed clarification into the law to say that a change at a facility that warrants this NSR review should be based on a maximum hourly emissions rate, a clear and objective measure, which, by the way, is consistent with similar provisions in the Clean Air Act. This will greatly accelerate decision-making at regulated facilities around the nation. So I want to thank our colleague from Virginia, Mr. Griffith, for his efforts on this legislation. I urge my colleagues to support this common-sense bill. And I would be happy to yield or yield back. I'll yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back his time. Chair looks to see if anyone wants to speak on the bill. If not, without objection, the chair calls up H.R. 3128 and asks the clerk to report.
H.R. 3128, to amend Section 111 of the Clean Air Act to clarify when a physical change in or change in the method of operation of a stationary source constitutes a modification and for other purposes.
Without objection, the first reading of the bill is dispensed with, and the bill will be open for amendment at any point. So ordered. No. Oh, the chair recognizes himself to offer an amendment in the nature of substitute, and the clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 3128, offered by Mr. Shimkus.
Without objection, the reading of the amendment is dispensed with, and the chair is recognized for 5 minutes in support of the amendment. This amendment in the nature of a substitute is substantially similar to the new source review and discussion draft that this subcommittee examined in May. The amendment makes some clarifications based on the legislative hearing, as well as feedback from EPA and stakeholders on the discussion draft. As with the base bill, it seeks to reduce the complexity and uncertainty that discourage owners from modernizing and maintaining existing facilities by clarifying when a change at an existing facility requires new source review permit. To illustrate why this legislation is needed, one hearing witness told us about a project to switch a manufacturing facility to a cleaner burning fuel that was canceled because the current new source review emissions accounting methodology incorrectly showed that on paper that the project would cause an emissions increase. Yet the project would have resulted in improved air quality. In another example, a witness described how customers are choosing to not buy and install a particular gas turbine upgrade technology that is capable of improving turbine performance by 2.6% while lowering carbon dioxide emissions per megawatt hour by 6.5%, because doing so might trigger the NSR new source review permitting process. These examples highlight how new source review hinders investments that actually lead to environmental benefits. The main reason for this is because the new source review program measures future emissions using a complicated annual emissions projection approach. Projecting future annual emissions is a difficult and confusing process that requires the consideration of many complex factors, which frequently overestimates the facility's future emissions. Rather than undergo this costly process, companies commonly choose to forego incremental improvements to their facilities. The base bill improves the new source review process by specifying the use of an hourly emissions rate test for determining whether an upgrade at an existing facility causes an emission increase, thereby requiring an owner to obtain a new source review permit. This amendment further clarifies how to implement that test. An hourly rate test is straightforward to carry out because it only relies upon engineering design factors, not complicated future emission projections and assessments. A separate program under the Clean Air Act, the New Source Performance Standard, has successfully used an hourly rate test with little to no controversy for over 40 years. And I think that's the basic point of our argument and debate. The amendment also specifies more clearly the circumstances by which air pollution control, efficiency, and equipment repairs do or do not trigger new source review. This amendment clarifies the base bill and makes targeted improvements to how the new source review program works, and I urge my colleagues to vote in support of the amendment in nature of substitute. Votes have been called. We would like to recess and return to consider the amendments to the substitute amendment after the last vote in series, if that's okay with my ranking member. This markup is recessed.
It was easier when we know what we're on. Okay.
Now, your son has been quoted as saying, "I get along better with you than he does."
The chairman calls the markup back to order, and we are on the amendment and in nature of the substitute. Are there any bipartisan, I hate to ask, any bipartisan amendments to the amendment in nature? None. Seeing none, are there any amendments to the amendment in nature of substitute?
Mr. Chair, I have an amendment at the desk. I believe amendment number 1.
Clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 3128, offered by Mr. Tonko.
Gentleman from New York is recognized 5 minutes in support of his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. As I said earlier, I have a real concern that the bill before us today is going to result in more air pollution. The New Source Review Program was intended to ensure that when a facility made modifications to expand capacity or extend design life by replacing major equipment, that the facility would also upgrade its pollution control equipment to meet modern standards. This bill will allow facilities to make these modifications without having to install modern pollution control equipment or make any adjustments to reduce their emissions. There are still many communities across our country where air quality is not healthy and pollution levels are too high. Regulatory relief for facilities in these areas means poor air quality and more health problems for neighboring communities. My amendment would exclude facilities that are within 5 miles of a school, hospital, veterans health care facility, or a nursing home from the NSR loopholes of this bill. Children, veterans, the elderly, and people being treated in a hospital are already more vulnerable to air pollution than adults in good health. Shifting the threshold test for whether a modification will trigger a review of a proposed project to a change in the maximum hourly emission rate of a pollutant virtually assures the requirements of the NSR program will never apply. It is unlikely that any construction project, including one that would expand a facility's capacity and increase its overall pollution output substantially, would alter the maximum hourly rate of pollution produced by the plant. At a minimum, a facility in close proximity to schools, to nursing homes, to hospitals, and veterans health centers should face a threshold for evaluation that ensures pollution levels will not increase. My amendment will not fix all of the problems this legislation creates. It will not limit all of the pollution increases it will allow, but it will offer some protection to those who are the most vulnerable to the diseases worsened or caused by air pollution. With that, I urge my colleagues to support this amendment.
Will the gentleman yield?
Yeah, I will yield.
Mr. Chairman, thank you, and I speak in favor of this amendment. It really highlights the fundamental problem with the bill, which is it'll make it easier for polluters to increase their emissions and harm vulnerable populations. I'm a representative for a non-attainment area under the Clean Air Act, so this is not an abstract issue for my constituents. The northern Front Range of Denver is already plagued by a rise in ozone, which is associated with a wide range of public health harms, including an elevated risk of asthma and cardiovascular disease. We know that polluters are already pushing to take advantage of every loophole they can find. For example, Suncor Energy has a refinery just outside my district that's in the midst of seeking dozens of permit modifications. They're evading undergoing a new source review by claiming all the modifications are below the significance level. Residents of the Swansea-Elyria neighborhood, which is right next to this refinery, have expressed grave concerns about these modifications and the facility's ongoing operations. Earth Justice found that the refinery has filed at least 40 malfunction reports and 21 permit deviation reports since January 2013. Meanwhile, the Department of Public Health and Environment of Denver has reported that residents from this neighborhood and Globeville increasingly suffer from several diseases associated with elevated air pollution, including asthma, cancer, cardiovascular disease, diabetes, and obesity. As is so often the case for neighborhoods near industrial facilities, these communities have lower median incomes and a higher proportion of minority residents than other areas of my district. That's what's happening today under current law. The bill before us today only will open up further loopholes. Polluters will spew more toxins in the air, and vulnerable populations, low-income areas, and communities of color will suffer the health consequences. I urge my colleague to support the amendment and to oppose the underlying bill. I thank the gentleman for yielding, and I yield back.
Thank you. Anyone else wishing to use 45 seconds?
Yield.
I yield to Representative Green.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, members, if this bill passes, the district I represent will have 200 more tons a year in emissions. I have a very industrial area with refineries, chemical plants, and we are challenged on our air emissions already, and this bill would make it even worse. And I want to thank my New York colleague for yielding to me. Just wanted to let you know that this is not going to help air quality in my community.
Gentleman yields, and I yield back, Mr. Chair.
Gentleman yields back his time. Chair recognizes. What purpose, gentleman from Ohio, seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I rise in opposition to this amendment.
Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to note that in earlier subcommittee hearings, 2 state air regulators testified that H.R. 3128 does not reduce the ability of air regulators to successfully control emissions from existing sources, and that H.R. 3128 would not allow a facility to operate in a way that would violate any emission limits or air quality conditions specified in the facility's operating permit. We're trying to improve the NSR permitting process so that companies are better able to modernize and maintain existing facilities. Moreover, the bill makes it easier for companies to carry out projects at existing facilities that actually will reduce emissions, like incremental pollution control upgrades and energy efficiency improvements. This bill is about providing greater clarity and certainty to the NSR process so that companies can confidently make needed investments and improvements to our nation's existing industrial facilities, which will lead to a stronger economy and more American jobs. And lastly, in no way does this bill allow existing facilities to increase emission levels beyond currently established operating permit limits. So, Mr. Chairman, this amendment is unnecessary, and I urge a no vote on this amendment.
Would the gentleman yield to me?
Yes, I will yield.
Thank you. I want to just follow up on my colleague from Ohio. Appreciate him taking the time. The bill basically goes from a yearly calculation to the hourly calculation. It's the same standard that we use under the National Ambient Air Quality Standard. I think it's instructive in that we, for 40 years, we've used it under that program, and I don't think any of us have heard complaints on either side on how the environmental rule and regulations is implied in that instance. So we're just trying to take a successful regulatory look at and moving the new source review program to that type of standard. I would also just add that, and I could read the list of all the environmental rules and regs that comply with stationary facilities, and there's about 12. This law does not reduce any of the current laws that deal with power plants. So those laws stay in effect. And with that, I would then yield back to the gentleman from Ohio.
Mr. Chairman, unless anyone else needs time, I yield back also.
Gentleman yields back his time. For what purpose, gentleman from New Jersey, seek recognition?
Strike the last word in support of Mr. Tonko.
Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Schools, hospitals, veterans' health facilities, and nursing home care for those most vulnerable to health problems created or exacerbated by air pollution. And some of these facilities already are in areas with unhealthy air quality. So we should not allow additional pollution in these areas, and this bill puts public health at risk. These facilities produce multiple pollutants that are extremely harmful to public health, like sulfur dioxide, nitrogen oxide, carbon monoxide, and particulate matter. And air pollution around schools is linked to poorer student health and academic performance. We should be working harder to improve air quality, not helping polluters to degrade it. Many elderly patients have reduced lung function and weaker immune systems. Air pollutants irritate their conditions and in some cases contribute to their premature death. And many of the facilities that will benefit from this rollback of the NSR program have already avoided controlling their pollution for decades. When they expand their output and fail to install modern pollution control equipment, they'll add tons of additional pollutants to the air every year. So Mr. Tonko's amendment will not fix all of the serious problems with this bill, but it will at least prevent facilities in areas that serve our most vulnerable citizens from continuing to avoid doing their fair share to clean up the air that we all have to breathe. And so I would urge support for his amendment.
Gentleman yields back his time. Check recognize himself for 5 minutes in opposition. I saw Gene looking over at me saying, Shimkus doesn't know what he's talking about. I think the standard was new source performance standards is what, when I noticed that, I go, I said something that was incorrect. So the hourly standard is applying to the new source performance standards part of the regulation. The other thing that I'd like to highlight is that nothing, and we believe this, nothing in this bill will negatively impact air quality. And under the law, if a change at a facility would adversely affect public health, as this amendment is purporting to assume, then the project must go through the full new source review permitting process as specified in Section 2 of the bill. All we want to do is to allow our facilities to be able to update and modernize, either become more energy efficient or obviously have a lower profile on emissions by upgrading. And I think it's been stated that there has been folks slow in responding, and I think the way the new source review program is currently implemented, that's the reason why we haven't had updating to the system. So with that, anyone else seeking time? Seeing none, I yield back the balance of my time. Anyone seek time? Seeing none, the vote now occurs on Amendment 1. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed, no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it. The noes have it. A roll call vote has been asked for, and it is accepted, so the clerk will record the roll.
Mr. McKinley? No. Mr. McKinley votes no. Mr. Barton? Mrs. Blackburn? Mr. Harper? No. Mr. Harper votes no. Mr. Olson? No. Mr. Olson votes no. Mr. Johnson? No. Mr. Johnson votes no. Mr. Flores? No. Mr. Flores votes no. Mr. Hudson? No. Mr. Hudson votes no. Mr. Kramer? No. Mr. Kramer votes no. Mr. Wahlberg? No. Mr. Wahlberg votes no. Mr. Carter? No. Mr. Carter votes no. Mr. Duncan? No. Mr. Duncan votes no. Chairman Walden? Mr. Tonko?
Yes.
Mr. Tonko votes aye. Mr. Ruiz? Aye. Mr. Ruiz votes aye. Mr. Peters? Mr. Peters votes aye. Mr. Green? Aye. Mr. Green votes aye. Ms. DeGette? Ms. DeGette votes aye. Mr. McNerney? Mr. McNerney votes aye. Mr. Cardenas? Ms. Dingle? Ms. Dingle votes aye. Ms. Matsui? Ms. Matsui votes aye. Mr. Pallone? Mr. Pallone votes aye. Chairman Shimkus?
Shimkus votes no.
Chairman Shimkus votes no.
Anyone else seeking to be recorded? Seeing none, the clerk will report.
Mr. Chairman, on that vote, there were 11 ayes and 9 noes. Mr. Chairman, on that vote, there were 9 ayes and 11 noes.
9 ayes, 11 noes. The amendment is not agreed to. Is there any other amendments to the amendment in the nature of a substitute? Almost. All right, someone has one. For all purposes, gentlelady from Michigan, rise.
I have an amendment, Mr. Chair.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 3128, offered by Ms. Dingle.
The gentlelady is recognized 5 minutes in support of her amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My amendment proposes to make what I believe is a very simple change to the underlying bill to exempt any source of lead in air emissions from the provisions of this act. Lead is a dangerous and pervasive substance. Once in our bodies, lead is absorbed into and stored in our bones, blood, and tissues. Even exposure to small amounts of lead can have long-lasting and devastating health effects. Lead-poisoned children have decreased neurological function and behavioral issues. Exposures to pregnant women cause irreversible damage to a baby's developing systems and potentially stillbirths or miscarriages. And even low levels of exposure in adults have been linked to adverse health effects like high blood pressure, heart disease, kidney disease, reduce fertility, and violent or criminal behavior. Sources of lead emissions vary from one area to another. At the national level, major sources of lead in the air are metal processing, particularly lead smelters, and other sources are waste incinerators, copper smelting, utilities, and lead-acid battery manufacturers. The highest air concentrations of lead are usually found near lead smelters. Historically, lead gasoline was also a major source of pollution. We've made great progress, and lead emissions sharply declined after it was eliminated from gasoline and remained low. But the provisions of the bill before us could undo all of that good work. Major stationary sources of lead emissions, like lead-acid battery manufacturers or lead smelters, would be given the green light to expand and ramp up their operations without control or consequence. As long as they maintain a consistent rate of emissions, these polluters would be able to increase the frequency and intensity of their operations, triggering an exponential surge in their emissions. And where do you think all of that new lead pollution goes? Into the surrounding and downwind communities. It will be inhaled while still in the air by children on the playground, and it'll be ingested after it settles in water or on land by families sitting down for dinner. The people of Michigan can't afford the victims of more lead, there to be more victims of more lead poisoning, and we are not alone. We should be working together to advance policies that help protect the people who live in the communities we represent, not the polluters who have been championed by this administration. In the spirit of putting people over polluters, my amendment would ensure any facility that emits lead into the air is barred from the loophole provisions of this act. I urge my colleagues to support this amendment, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Generally yields back the balance of her time. Anyone seek time in opposition? Chair recognizes the gentleman from Mr. Harper for what
Move to
purpose?
strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This amendment is really unnecessary. Under the bill, the EPA administrator is given explicit authority to deal with any situation in which an increase in hourly emissions would cause an adverse effect on human health or the environment. Moreover, this legislation does not affect the very stringent National Ambient Air Quality Standards, or NAAQS, requirement that govern the levels of lead in the air. In cases where a facility does emit lead, this bill does not affect operating permit requirements that relate to emissions levels of lead. Put plainly, NSR reform in no way, shape, or form alters NAAQS or a state's obligation to attain and maintain NAAQS, and NAAQS are set at levels deemed protective of public health. These standards have been tremendously successful. In point of fact, lead levels are down 99% from 1990, and facilities in communities that presently do not meet the lead standards are subject to requirements that are completely unaffected by this bill. This amendment would place an unnecessary restraint on certain facilities from seeking to make reasonable changes that would include incremental air pollution controls, efficiency improvements, and other changes that ensure more effective operations to the benefit of the communities they serve. This bill, H.R. 3128, makes it easier for owners to carry out pollution control projects, energy efficient projects, and equipment reliability and safety improvements. I urge a no vote on this amendment. And with that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back his time. Anyone seeking time? Chair recognizes the gentleman from New York. For what purpose?
Mr. Chairman, I want to strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized 5 minutes.
Thank you. I speak in support of Representative Dingell's amendment. Lead is a very serious issue that affects everyone, and in particular, very much concerned about the impact on children. At the request of Member Pallone, our ranking member of the Standing Committee, and myself as ranker on the Environment Subcommittee, and the Democrats as members of this committee, we asked that the GAO conduct a report, assemble a report, and just today, I believe around 2 o'clock, they issued that report that addresses lead in drinking water in our schools. Now, the findings are very troubling. 41% of schools serving some 12 million students have not tested for lead recently. Of the schools that did test, elevated levels were found 37% of the time. 16% of schools did not even know whether or not they did test for lead. Now, we need to continue to think about the best ways to reduce the risk of lead. Yes, we can do that very well by testing drinking water and addressing it that way, but it's also part of air pollution, and that should be a concern also. So given this serious nature of lead contamination, I, again, support the amendment offered by Ms. Dingle. I believe it makes the bill stronger, and ask that my colleagues support her amendment. With that, I yield back. I'll yield to Mr. Pallone, please.
Thank you. I wanted to also express support for Ms. Dingle's amendment. One source category of lead emissions is coal-fired power plants. Under the current new source review program, any existing coal-fired power plant that wants to modify its facilities or operations must obtain permits to ensure the changes won't worsen air pollution, and they also must use up-to-date pollution controls. However, an existing loophole in the Clean Air Act, which allowed facilities built before 1978 to run without new controls until they retired or did construction that triggered new source review, has been misused, letting dirtier plants operate longer at the expense of public health. A recent independent investigation found that last year, 145 coal plants without control technology collectively put out nearly 580,000 tons of sulfur dioxide. Of these, 107 were built prior to 1978, meaning they directly benefited from this loophole. And while this investigation did not focus on the lead emissions from these facilities, it is certainly relevant to the debate we're having today. The bill before us seeks to exacerbate this very loophole in the NSR program using fuzzy math to virtually guarantee that existing sources will never have to reduce their air pollution. And Congress never intended for existing sources of harmful air pollution to be grandfathered forever. But these zombie facilities have been able to game the system for 40 years. So-called NSR reform is just the latest iteration of their mission to avoid ever cleaning up their act. And with that reality in mind, Ms. Dingle's amendment ensures that these dirty facilities do not get a free pass on their lead emissions. And since these perpetual grandfathered facilities are also a source of lead air pollution, they would not be able to take advantage of the provision of the Act. So I believe it is eminently reasonable to pass this amendment. It would vastly improve the bill, and I would urge all members to vote yes on her amendment. I yield back to Mr. Tonko.
Mr. Gennari, do you want to?
I thank the ranking member for yielding. My congressional district has poor air quality, which has caused a variety of illnesses for my constituents. California has been working to improve the new source review and should be an example on how to improve this program, where this bill weakens the Clean Air Act and would put the public health at risk and is in stark opposition to the public's overwhelming support of the Clean Air Act. The Clean Air Act was passed on a bipartisan basis. It was signed by a Republican president. It's worked. So this bill looks like an ideological run at eliminating regulations. Let's work together. Instead of pushing through a partisan message bill, I support the amendment and oppose H.R. 3128.
Anyone else choosing to use 30 seconds? If not, Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Time chair recognizes himself for 5 minutes in opposition to the amendment. So the air regulation that deals with lead is the National Ambient Air Quality Standards, and this new source review bill does not affect that standard. So the standard for lead in the air is left unchanged. The premise of the bill is to make it easier for owners to carry out pollution control projects, energy efficiency projects, and equipment reliability to safety improvements. And I urge a no vote on this amendment, and I yield back my time. Anyone else seeking time to speak on the amendment? Seeing none, the vote now occurs on the amendment offered by the gentlelady from Michigan. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. And those have it. The opinion of the chair, the noes have it. The noes have it. the gentlelady from Michigan? The gentlelady requests a recorder vote. A recorder vote will be called. The clerk will call the vote.
Mr. McKinley? Mr. McKinley votes no. Mr. Barton? Mr. Barton votes no. Mrs. Blackburn? Mr. Harper? Mr. Harper votes no. Mr. Olson? Mr. Olson votes no. Mr. Johnson? Mr. Johnson votes no. Mr. Flores? Mr. Flores votes no. Mr. Hudson? Mr. Hudson votes no. Mr. Kramer? Mr. Kramer votes no. Mr. Wahlberg? Mr. Wahlberg votes no. Mr. Carter? Mr. Carter votes no. Mr. Duncan? Mr. Duncan votes no. Chairman Walden? Chairman Walden votes no. Mr. Tonko? Mr. Tonko votes aye. Mr. Ruiz? Mr. Ruiz votes aye. Mr. Peters? Mr. Peters votes aye. Mr. Green? Mr. Green votes aye. Ms. DeGette? Ms. DeGette votes aye. Mr. McNerney? Mr. McNerney votes aye. Mr. Cardenas? Ms. Dingle? Ms. Dingle votes aye. Ms. Matsui? Ms. Matsui votes aye. Mr. Pallone? Mr. Pallone votes aye. Chairman Shimkus?
Chairman Shimkus votes no.
Chairman Shimkus votes no.
Anyone else wishing to be recorded? Seeing none, the clerk will report the vote.
Mr. Chairman, on that vote, there were 9 ayes and 13 nays.
9 ayes and 13 nays. The amendment is not agreed to. The question now is on, if there are no further discussion, the vote occurs on the amendment in nature of substitute. All those in favor shall signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. The ayes have it. The amendment in the nature of substitute is agreed to. The question now occurs on forwarding H.R. 3128 as amended to the full committee. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. The ayes have it, appear to have it. Can we have a roll call? The roll call is requested. The clerk will report the roll.
Mr. McKinley? Mr. McKinley votes aye. Mr. Barton? Mr. Barton votes aye. Mrs. Blackburn? Mr. Harper? Mr. Harper votes aye. Mr. Olson? Mr. Olson votes aye. Mr. Johnson? Mr. Johnson votes aye. Mr. Flores? Mr. Flores votes aye. Mr. Hudson? Mr. Hudson votes aye. Mr. Kramer? Mr. Kramer votes aye. Mr. Wahlberg? Mr. Wahlberg votes aye. Mr. Carter? Mr. Carter votes aye. Mr. Duncan? Mr. Duncan votes aye. Chairman Walden? Chairman Walden votes aye. Mr. Tonko? Mr. Tonko votes no. Mr. Ruiz? Mr. Ruiz votes no. Mr. Peters? Mr. Peters votes no. Mr. Green? Mr. Green votes no. Ms. DeGette? Ms. DeGette votes no. Mr. McNerney? Mr. McNerney votes no. Mr. Cardenas? Ms. Dingle? Ms. Dingle votes no. Ms. Matsui? Ms. Matsui votes no. Mr. Pallone? Mr. Pallone votes no. Chairman Shimkus? Chairman Shimkus votes aye.
The clerk will report.
Mr. Chairman, on that vote, there were 13 ayes and 9 nays.
13 ayes, 9 nays. The bill is reported to the full committee. Without objection, staff is authorized to make technical and conforming changes to the legislation approved by the subcommittee today. So ordered. Chair asks unanimous consent that the following letters in support of H.R. 3128 be entered into the record. A joint letter from the affiliates of North American Building Trade Unions, do I list all these guys? No. American Iron and Steel Institute, Portland Cement Association, American Forest and Paper Association, National Mining Association, American Public Power Association, National Rural Electric Cooperative Association, National Association of Manufacturers, U.S. Chamber, Pennsylvania Chamber of Commerce, Citizens for Responsible Energy Solutions, and American Energy Alliance. Without objection, so ordered. And without objection, the subcommittee stands adjourned, and the chair thanks the members for being present.